You're listening to Tea with Tolkien, a podcast for the Hobbit at heart. We are on the 8th week of our Silmarillion read-along, and this week we will be covering chapters 10, 11, and 12. Since we've got quite a bit of ground to cover this week, I'm just going to jump right in with chapter 10, of the Sindar. Elu, Thingol, and Melian were king and queen of all the elves in Beleriand. These elves were called the Sindar, the grey elves of starlit Beleriand. Now, at the end of the first age of Melkor's captivity, Melian brought into the world Luthien. During the second age of Melkor's captivity, the dwarves came into Beleriand, so a lot of exciting stuff is happening in Beleriand. The dwarves named themselves the Khazad, but the Sindar called them the Naugrim, which means the stunted people, and is kind of rude, in my opinion. And they also called them the Gonhirim, masters of stone, which is less rude. The dwarves delved great halls and mansions for themselves, and the greatest of these was Khazad Dûm, later called Moria. So if you haven't even read any Tolkien, but you've seen the movies, you will recognize that name, so that's pretty exciting. The elves were amazed to see the dwarves, but they couldn't understand each other at first because they each had their own language. Now the dwarves were eager to learn the elvish speech, but they were reluctant to teach their own. So from there we've got a lot of dwarves learning Elvish, but not really any elves learning the Dwarvish language. Tolkien writes, "Ever cool was the friendship between the Naugrim and the Eldar." So they had kind of like a working relationship where they profited from one another and they got along in general, but they weren't anywhere near like warm best friends, nothing quite like that. Melian knew that the peace of Arda would not last, and so they commissioned the dwarves to build and fortify Menegroth, which is the 1,000 caves. As the third age of Melkor's captivity drew on, evil creatures came into Beleriand. Thingol then commissioned the dwarves to make them weapons, whereas before they didn't really have any weapons, and so this strengthened their people and helped protect them. Around this time, Denethor, son of Lenwë, came to dwell in Osiriand with his kindred. Tolkien writes, this really beautiful, like poetic quote is kind of just, it's like Tolkien just had this quote in his head and he was like, where should I drop this? Because it's really beautiful, but it does fit into this chapter. And he writes, "But of bliss and glad life there is little to be said before it ends. As works fair and wonderful, while still they endure for eyes to see, are their own record, and only when they are in peril or broken forever do they pass into song." He also writes that in those days the beauty of Melian was as the noon, and the beauty of Luthien was as the dawn in spring, which is just an absolute beautiful description. And so right now they're living in a very wonderful, peaceful, blissful time. However, as is known to happen in the Silmarillion, these days of bliss are soon coming to their end. Once Melkor was freed from his captivity, and we all know what he did a couple chapters ago when he slew the trees of Valinor and came back into Middle-earth, Ungoliant also came with him, and she came to dwell in the region called Ered Gorgoroth, which means the Mountains of Terror. So not at all a happy place. Morgoth returned to Angband, and there he grew in strength. Then Morgoth decided it was time to take on King Thingol, so his forces assailed the people of Thingol, but with the aid of the Naugrim and the hosts of Denethor's people, they were defeated and retreated back to Morgoth. However, this victory was dearly bought because Denethor was slain, and because of this, many of his people kind of fled into the forests and didn't really participate in civilization after that. And these were now called the Lyquendi, the Green Elves. After this, Melian put forth her power and guarded their region with what is called the Girdle of Melian. Their hidden kingdom was then called Eglador, and later it was called Doriath. After this, they basically just sat in a watchful peace. Everyone is still a little bit stressed out, but there is peace for a time because they've hidden themselves away. And in this same time, Feanor came at last to Middle-earth. So that kind of puts it into perspective when all of these things are happening, because a lot is going on at the same time, but obviously Tolkien can't, cover everything in the same chapter. That'd be crazy. And now moving on to chapter 11 of the Sun and the Moon and the Hiding of Valinor. I bet you can't guess what this chapter is about. Okay. Of the Sun and the Moon and the Hiding of Valinor. Back to Valinor. After the flight of the Noldor, the Valar sat long in the Ring of Doom. But, Tolkien writes, they were not idle. And I thought this part was really funny, because Tolkien is kind of like, listen guys, I know they looked like they were idle, and I know that Feanor kind of accused them of being idle, but like really they weren't. I don't know. It just seemed like he was kind of making an excuse for the Valar. However, he also does say that the Valar are able to like work things out in their own minds silently. So it might look like they're not doing anything, yet they still are. And I guess you just have to trust them. I do feel a little bit jaded when it comes to the Valar. I don't know if you can tell, by the way. I just said that. I guess I gave myself away. When they learned that Feanor had come to Middle-earth at last, they finally, at that point, got up and tried to heal the trees. I don't know why they waited so long. See, once again, if you're like a Tolkien scholar, please let me know, because it doesn't really make sense to me that they would, if my trees of Valinor were dying, I would try to heal them right away. But, I'm not Vala, so I guess I don't know. So they got up and tried to heal the trees, but they were not able to. However, Telperion bore one last silver flower, and Lorelin bore one last golden fruit. Manwë hollowed them, and Aule made vessels in which to preserve them. These were then given to Varda that they might become lamps of heaven, aka the sun and the moon. The sun and the moon were each guided by one of the Maiar. The moon arose first, and it arose just as Fingolfin blew his silver trumpets upon the shores of Middle-earth. The moon arose before the sun, which I thought was interesting, and it happened just as Fingolfin blew his silver trumpets upon the shores of Middle-earth. So that's also a really beautiful visual. Varda then set the sun and moon on their journeys, each lighting the earth in their own time. Now Morgoth hated these new lights, and he was confounded by them. He tried to make a little war against the moon, but he was unable to. And then when the sun came out, he was like completely flabbergasted, because he did not see this coming, and he could not endure the sunlight. So he shrouded himself in shadow, him and all of his buddies. He created these like little evil shadows to hide in. After giving light to Middle-earth, the Valar they were worried that Valinor would become destroyed, and so they decided to hide Valinor. They raised up the sides of the Pelori, which are those mountains that surround the Blessed Realm, kind of like a border. And so they raised them up super, super, super high, and they smoothed out the sides. So basically, nobody could come in at all. And this is kind of interesting because when you think of like gods living and then, you think gods in like a special world, and there's a big tall mountain, it made me think of Olympus immediately, which was kind of a fun little connection. They fortified the outer area. There was really only one way to get in or out from the Blessed Realm, because they didn't want to deprive the elves that were living there of the starlight and like the fresh air of Middle-earth. And so they did leave a little opening, but they fortified that pretty heavily, and they placed a sleepless watch there. After that, they set up the enchanted isles, and they filled the seas with shadow and bewilderment. So after this, nobody was able to sail to Valinor on their own, whereas before, I guess it was a bit easier. Now it was nearly impossible. Tolkien writes, "And of the many messengers that in after days sailed into the west, none came ever to Valinor, save one only, the mightiest mariner of song." And that is just an incredible teaser that Tolkien just dropped right there. I know who it is since I've read the Silmarillion before, but if you haven't read the Silmarillion before, you'll find out. It's very exciting. Now I want to talk briefly, kind of do a run through about the sun and the moon, because You might be getting them confused if this is your first time reading this chapter. Let's start with the sun. The sun was made from the last golden fruit of Lorelin. It was guided by Arion, a Maya of Vana. The sun was called Anar, the fire golden, by the Vanyar, and it was called Vasa, the heart of fire, by the Noldor. Arion was chosen because she was a spirit of fire who was not deceived by Melkor in the beginning, and she did not fear the heats of Lorelin. The rising of the sun signified the dominion of men and the waning of the elves. And interestingly, the sun is given feminine attributes, whereas pretty often we see the sun described as a more masculine type of thing. But I thought it was really neat how Tolkien gives the sun feminine attributes. Now onto the moon. The moon was made from the last silver flower of Telperion. It was guided by Tilion, a Maya of Orome. It was called Isil, the Sheen, by the Vanyar, or called Rana, the Wayward, by the Noldor. The moon arose first before the sun, but while the sun followed a pretty consistent pattern, the moon often varied in its path and timing. Tilion is said to be in love with Arion, and he is always pursuing her, which creates like a really romantic idea within this mythology that I thought was really cool. The moon cherished the memory of the elves, and it was given masculine attributes. I made a little graphic, and I put it up on the blog, just kind of giving a quick bullet point list of the attributes of the sun and the moon, in case you have a difficult time remembering who's who and what's what. That might be helpful. So that's up on the blog, which you can find in the show notes. And now on to chapter 12 of Men. This week has been so exciting because first we get the dwarves, then we get the sun and the moon, and now we've got men. There's so many new things happening in this week. So I think it's really fun how these chapters ended up being grouped together in our book club. Now the Valar were at peace in Valinor, and Morgoth had dominion over Middle-earth, and he was held back only by the light of the sun and the valor of the Noldor. Then began the years of the sun, and the younger children of Iluvatar finally awoke in Hildorian. These are men, in case you didn't know that. They got a lot of names, to be honest. I'm going to read them to you, and they just get progressively meaner and meaner as they go, and I just picture the elves being like the older child, just really bullying their younger sibling. So they were called the Atani, the second people, the Hildor, the followers, the Apanonar, the afterborn, the Angwar, the sickly, the Firimar, the mortals, the usurpers, the strangers, the inscrutable, the self-cursed, the heavy-handed, the night-fearers, and last but not least, the children of the sun. Tolkien then writes, "Of men little is told in these tales which concerns the eldest days." So really, there's not a lot about men in the Quentis Silmarillion, but Tolkien did want to introduce them and give us a little bit of information about them. So the men befriended the Dark Elves, and they learned much from them. But they learned little of the Valar, and they knew of them only by rumor. So I thought this was very interesting, the way that the children of Iluvatar, they began living very closely with the Valar, especially those who went to Aman. But now, when we get to this point, the men haven't even really seen them or heard of them or communicated with them in any way. They just know of them by rumor. For a time, the elves and men lived in happiness, but the lies of Morgoth and the curse upon Feanor and his kindred were ever at work. Elves and men were alike in body, but elves were immortal and men were not. Men were much more prone to illness and injury, and their fate after death was unknown to the Eldar. For a long time, the elves and men were able to live in peace and as allies, but eventually Morgoth caused them to become estranged. And then Tolkien writes, "The fate of men after death, maybe, is not in the hands of the Valar, nor was all foretold in the music of the Ainur." So that might explain in a way why the Valar are very distant from the men. They don't really know very much about them, and it honestly might not even be a part of their dominion, if that makes sense. I don't think that's the right word, but they're their relationship with the Eldar is very different from their relationship with the men. So as we come to the end of that chapter, something that's just been in my mind is wondering and struggling with this idea that the Valar have apparently abandoned Middle-earth. Sure, they gave them the light of the sun as a form of protection, but is that really enough? And one thing that I thought was interesting was someone in our Discord server named Gideon wrote, I'm just going to read their comment because I thought it was very good. They wrote, in the metaphor of describing Middle-earth as Morgoth's ring, I think Tolkien talks about the fact that the Valar knew destroying Morgoth and removing him from Middle-earth would destroy Middle-earth itself. I wonder if we don't get that perspective in the Silmarillion, since it's likely not something the Valar would have counseled the elves about. And I thought that was definitely an interesting perspective, and one that I hadn't considered, because after looking at all of the destruction that had already happened within the world due to the Valar fighting against Melkor, I don't think it's implausible that to ultimately destroy Morgoth would probably ruin the entire world. And it reminds me in a way of like in a superhero movie when the superheroes are fighting each other and they just totally destroy an entire city. I kind of imagine that is what it would be like for the Valar to come against Morgoth at this point, because he's grown so, not that he's grown so powerful, but that his reach is just grown so far, and that his power has grown very widespread, and he's become very attached and interwoven with the earth. So that was something that I hadn't thought about, and I thought it was a really good point. So I wanted to bring it up, and I would love to hear everyone's thoughts on this. Why do you think that the Valar kind of closed themselves off from Middle-earth after this? Why do you think that the Valar closed themselves off from Middle-earth after what has happened so far? Do you think it was a good choice? I would love to kind of see how our discussion plays out in our Discord server. And if you are not a part of our Discord server, you are more than welcome to join. You can go to teawithtolkien.com/discord to sign up with your email address, and then you will get the link to the server in your inbox. So we'd be so happy to have you. Even if you aren't a part of our book club, we've got all kinds of different discussions going on, just about all kinds of various topics, from recipes to gaming to talking about Lord of the Rings on Prime to like tea that we're drinking. It's just been a really wonderful place, and we would love to have you be a part of our community. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end this episode, and I will see you all next week for chapters 13 and 14 of The Return of the Noldor and of Beleriand and its realms. I hope you have a really lovely week, and I will talk to you all soon.